All right, I think we're ready. All right, so our next period that we're going to be talking about is going to go about 2 years of age up through the preschool years. And then the next stage will take on the elementary school years. I do just want to mention a few things. So there's still a lot of debate about when early childhood ends and middle childhood begins. If you go into the field of early childhood education, that field actually goes up to the age of 8. I think mainly for social reasons, we say early childhood is about 2 years to about beginning of first grade, kindergarten. Those are the early childhood years, and then the elementary years from there. But I do just want to make everyone aware, if you become a early childhood expert, it's actually 0 to 8. And then middle childhood or late childhood is from 8 to puberty. So, but for our sakes, we're going to go from about the age of 2 up to about the age of 6. And then we'll use middle childhood for the remainder of it. And again, another part of this is too, when we looked at those theories and whatnot, we have to remember that, most of those, like Freud's theories, ended around 6 or 7, and then there was that latent period. And so we still have a lot of research that we need to do on middle childhood to really figure things out. So we still have a lot of work in that area to do. So the first thing that we should go over is kind of the body change, or the body proportions. Okay. We know we mentioned from about birth to 2 years old, a child develops very physically fast. In fact, within the first 12 months, they're going to double in size physically and in weight. And so, but this starts to dramatically slow right at around 2 years of age. And if you look at this graph, it compares, for example, up to 6.5 to what an adult body would look like. And then by about 15, we pretty much have a physical adult body. Maybe we know that there's still some height growth that goes on after that. And we know that after the age of 15.5, our body up until about the age of 34 stays pretty elastic still. But for those who are above the age of 34, and especially in your 40s, you'll notice that when you cut your finger, it takes 3-4 weeks to heal instead of a couple days. And bruising stays longer. The skin, when you lose weight, the skin doesn't tighten back up anymore. And that ends at around the age of about 34, 36. And on some other levels, again, when we get up to that age, it's around 34 to 36, where it's very difficult to train your voice, for example, because the voice box is starting to harden. And so it's not as flexible or as malleable as it is before that age. So, but this slow growth processing starts around 2 and really starts again at around 6.5, where we start to see slower growth. Okay. The other thing that we're going to start to develop, especially after the age of 2 and really ramping up at 5 and 6 years of age, is we're going to slow our focus on our gross motor skills, so the large muscles in the body, and we're going to start refining our fine motor skills, so the ability to write, type, speak in more coherent terms with more coherent words. And so we'll see a shift from the larger body muscles to the more fine muscles, such as those that work with the vocal cords, so your fingers and finer motor skills, such as those. Okay. We do know that, again, when we start to look at disorders, when we get above the age of about 2 and whatnot, This is when we start to look at developmental coordination type of disorders. So right around 2.5 is when we start to look for delays in motor milestones but we know that the earlier we get to these kiddos, the easier it will for them to get over it. And this is, I think, best displayed by a graph that I know that many moms and dads, when you take your kids to your pediatricians and they do this type of charting. So this is the body mass index. And really, I just want to point out a few things. One, growth is not fixed. Okay. So there isn't really the perfect, body in a sense. We are all somewhere between the 0th and the 95th percentile. Well, actually, I shouldn't say 0, at least 5%. But the thing that we start to get concerned with is when our BMIs, especially for example, with children, we start to get at this 10th percentile range. This can denote things like a severe underweight. It can denote anything from malnutrition that might be happening in the home to the child's metabolic system processing food and whatnot wrong. We also get concerned when children start to get about the 85th or 75th percentile on the upper range. Because that, as we know, just like with adults, when we start to get into those overweight ranges, there's a slew of different potential harm that children can have. And in fact, we've seen BMIs in children go up for the past 3 or 4 decades now. And we're seeing different adjustments in, for example, heart disease among children, diabetes among children, and those types of things. Okay. What I'd like to draw your attention to in this graph, though, is if you look in our early childhood years, okay, so we're starting at the age of 2, and you notice how the BMI on this upper range, we'll just make a comparison, is about the same on this range as an 7.5, 8-year-old. Okay. You'll notice, though, that it is during the early childhood years that our BMI and our weight actually go down instead of up. Okay. So our body mass, because we're growing taller quicker, so we saw that in that earlier graph, but we're also not maintaining the fat storages that were there when we were infants. Okay. And we know that that has very important things in infancy, and it's something we really didn't discuss when we went over infant development. We know that infants need a higher level of fat in their body because they burn that energy so much quicker than early childhood and those years, because of the mass expansion of the brain. I don't know if we really talked about this, but if we think about it, our brain weighs, I'm thinking it's like 7 grams. And if you think about that in the proportion to our body weight, it's very small, but it actually burns 20% of our body energy. Okay. So when we think about this, we have this system, especially in infants, that their body mass is not that big, their digestion system is not working as well, the consolidation, and so that higher body mass for infants is really important because it makes sure that brain is being fed. But then when we get to around the age of 2, we see that the body system becomes more efficient in its ability to handle and process food and whatnot. So we should see that BMI slip in early childhood. Okay. And again, the thing that I think frightens a lot of medical professionals is we're actually starting to see a flattening of this line instead of a dip that we've seen traditionally. So those are all kind of some things that are concerning our current medical field and pediatricians. So the other thing that we start to see to develop around the age of 2, and it really starts around the age of 3, 4, and 5, is an increase in what's called proprioception. Okay, and this is the awareness of your body as it's positioned in space. So where you are physically in the physical environment. Okay. And if you remember, it's around 24 months of age when we can recognize that that's us in the mirror, and that other people around the world exist, and I do in this space. And we know that this not only affects their own thoughts and awareness and self-recognition, but this proprioception, especially when it becomes a physical aspect of the child, starts to have awareness of body image, for example. Okay. And it's kind of interesting when we measure, body dissatisfaction. It's actually children around 24 months of age up to about 5, 6, 7 who tend to have very low body images of themselves. We think that a large part of this has to do with just the ability to recognize the body in space. But another portion of it is that we know that children start to do that social comparison. Okay, remember at 24 weeks, we get theory of mind. So we start thinking, well, what are those people thinking? And they might say things like, well, he's growing faster, he's taller than me, or she has better hair than me. And we start doing that social comparison between us and other children. And of course, we know that media plays a role in all of these things, and especially parents play a role in this type of body image that children have. We kind of touched on this when we were talking about Sigmund Freud, especially when we get to the phallic stage, is do children have a sense of sexuality? And it's really dependent upon how you define sexuality, in that you define it as the physical stimulation of a body part because it feels good, or do you define it in more of adult terms in that it's a reproductive bonding agent between you and someone else, and there's fantasization that is present? Okay. And again, I'll just reemphasize this from our Freud talk, is that we know that children will naturally explore their body and touch parts of their body that feel really good, where there's a lot of nerve bundles. And we can see this prenatally even. Okay. What we do know about this age group, and I think this is an important point, is as adults, we need to be comfortable with sexuality. Okay. In that when we talk to children about the function of their body parts, we need to make sure that we're giving it proper terms and what that body part really is. Okay. When I worked with children who were sexually abused, I will tell you guys that the number one thing that child sexual offenders played on was kind of the cute, uncomfortable names parents gave their children body parts. So naming the hoo-ha or the little button or something like that. Sex offenders played on that a lot, and they used the way parents talk to their children about their body parts against them. Probably my best example of this is I worked with a young lady and a little girl. She was around the age of 4, if I remember right. And she just ended up getting divorced from her husband. It was an amicable divorce, but he decided not to be a dad anymore, so he took off. So it was her and the little girl. And she then had to take on a more full-time work and work more often. And so she had her uncle and aunt watch the little girl while she was working. And so the uncle and aunt would pick her up from her. I believe she was in preschool, maybe kindergarten at the time. Now I'm getting my ages. Maybe it was preschool, because I believe it was Head Start. So yeah, it's preschool. Okay. And after a week or so, the little girl started to act out in school, started to be aggressive, started not wanting to do things like take a bath or do things like that. And mom wasn't sure. She thought maybe it was the divorce, maybe it was things going on. But then one time the little girl, and this is an area that's cold, like outside right now all the time. So they wear coats and stuff. And the little girl started coming home and saying, hey, Uncle put his hands in my pocket. Okay, well, coats have lots of pockets. Maybe he's just looking for stuff. But the little girl's behavior still got worse and worse and worse. And she more frequently came home and said, Uncle so-and-so is putting his hands in my pockets. And the mom one night, the little girl was actually taking a bath, and she turned around to the little girl and says, okay, hon, make sure you watch your pockets really good tonight. And she realized that the name she gave her little girl for her private parts was pockets, and that her uncle had literally been putting his hands in those spots. Okay. And the thing is when names aren't used correctly, both the child feels like they're not doing anything wrong or nothing going on, and the offender does as well, and it throws parents off, way off. Okay. And so one of the number one advice for parents who are raising young children is a penis is a penis and a vagina is a vagina. And those are the terms that we should probably be providing children, because there's definitely people out there that will take advantage of the names that we provide them that just don't make sense. So, and this goes back into the body awareness and the body image. And again, as I said, adults play a large role in that, and in the manipulation of the image a child has about their body and the people they have around them. So just wanted to bring up that example. I know we've talked about this when we talked about Freud and stuff, so that's where we can leave that. Okay. I do want to talk about risks, and I'll do a little bit of update on this because it's been updated in 2020. The thing that complicates our 2020 numbers is that thing we call the pandemic. And so some of this has changed in the few years of the pandemic versus what we've seen traditionally. But we still see, I'll just use these numbers as examples. We still see death from motor vehicle accidents going down, deaths from falls, such as falling off a swing, they're still going down. And we still see decreases in fire burns or fires. So that's all positive things. And we should just note, those are also things that have become heavily regulated, okay? If we look at motor vehicles and the safety laws that are put into place, if we look at the modern playground at parks, we know that they don't use rocks or wood chips under the swings anymore, and some don't even have swings anymore. And they use a product that takes the impact of a child's body falling on it. We also know that fire and fire awareness has been another large thing, requiring, for example, landlords to have active fire alarms, those types of things. So we can see how regulation and everything can help in decreasing this. Some areas that another area that we've done pretty good with is drownings is still falling. I will say, though, just kind of a concern here in Tucson is the drowning rate has actually flattened instead of continuing to go down for about the last 6 years. So that's something that we need to be aware of, at least living here in Southern Arizona, that those rates are flattening instead of continuing their decline. Suffocation and poisoning are the ones that have gone up. And these remain the same. The reason why you got to do some cautionary terms with this is we know during the pandemic, things like falling and motor vehicles, they went way down, obviously. Why? We weren't driving and we weren't going to parks anymore. But one thing we did see well above this 80% and this 30% is suffocation and poisoning, house poisoning. And when we talk about house poisoning, again, think of the kids who did that challenge with the Tide Pods and those kinds of things. And when we think about suffocation, it's usually plastic or some type of things. These are the two that we see on the increase, and especially over the pandemic, we saw these significantly increase. So we'll have to keep an eye on these numbers. I do think, for those living in the Tucson area, I don't know if this is true in the Phoenix area. This is something that you want to take a look at, and again, continue the practices we've had with the ones that are actually decreasing. So any questions on any of these?
Just about 2 months ago, I saw a news notification that there was like a two-year-old, like a couple of toddlers that were in the street and were in a motor vehicle accident, and they both just because they wanted seatbelt,
not in their seatbelts. Yeah, it's scary when we're not paying attention, that is for sure. And that's an example of, how things that we do to improve safety can actually make children safer, right? Good example. Okay. Let's talk really quick. So when we talk about the adverse childhood experience studies, okay, and we'll get into this more on Monday. About what is the adverse childhood experience studies. It's a study that has been going on for decades now, where it takes young children's adverse experiences and it relates them to adult experience, such as employment, graduating from school, and the like. And we'll go more into this on Monday. But the higher your score is, the more likely the less successful, quote unquote, and I'll give a little bit more explanation of this on Monday, the more difficult it is for that child to thrive is another good way to put it, okay? But we'll go over this study on Monday. There's some nuances to it that we should discuss. But I just wanted to kind of, during this part of the lecture, kind of give some things that they found while they've been doing this adverse child experience study. Is prevalence rates among different types of abuses and neglect. And this is I think an important distinction to be made. So according to their research, the highest prevalence of abuse is physical abuse, sexual abuse, and then emotional, physical, and emotional neglect, okay? But I'll go back to that. But if we look at reports to CPS, to Child Protective Services, and this is national wide, so that's why I'm using the old term CPS. And we look at children between the age of 2 and 7, then let's look at it, because it goes physical abuse and sexual abuse go to the lower end, where neglect is the higher end, okay? And what's been proposed about what these differences are is just when you see a child being neglected, so they're not being fed right, they're not being sent to school, those are all things that are very physically noticeable. Okay, same with physical abuse, seeing bruises all over a child and those types of things. Those are pretty identifiable types of abuses and neglect, okay? But when we get to these lower percentiles, child sexual abuse is something that a lot of families kind of sweep under the rug or try to ignore. It's hard to get a child to talk about these kinds of things because there's so much shame associated with them. When we look at this 8.5, when we're talking about psychologically maltreated, I should say psychologically maltreated is not providing a child with the ability to develop cognitively. So this is withholding a child from going to school, not giving them kind of an environment where they can learn, such as having books or learning about their environment, or being able to go outside and explore and be curious about the world. The other part of psychological maltreatment is how the parent talks to them. Okay, so it can be a combination of these things. It can be one or the other, or it can be a combination of the two. But the other one is the parent constantly putting the child down, telling them they're worthless, that they're no good, those type of psychological assaults. Okay, so you have one where you're neglecting the child's cognitive development. The other one is when you're basically abusing them emotionally. Okay. And then the other 10.6 is experiencing other type of maltreatment that could be possible. Okay. But when we go back to here, we see that the rates, when there's nothing tied to whether someone will get in trouble. So the adverse childhood experience study is you fill out, or your parents fill out, or someone measures it in a very confidential setting. So these are things that won't be reported to, for example, CPS, because it's done in a confidential manner and it's reported after the fact. So you usually report a child sexual abuse while it's actively occurring. These are all post surveys, and we see that the rates kind of flip, in a lot of ways. So it's kind of interesting when you give people the opportunity to talk about the abuse they're experiencing versus what the world reports. You almost end up in two different worlds. Okay. And just to put more flame on the fire, we do need to recognize that of the 26 modern countries, the United States, China, and Britain have the worst record of child welfare and abuse. When we compare to the 26 other modern countries that include places like Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and Italy. And in fact, when we look at the history of child welfare here in the United States, abuse of an animal was outlawed before the abuse of a child. In fact, it was the Society for Animal Welfare who helped get the child welfare law started here in the United States. Child labor laws didn't get implemented until about the 1920s. And we just saw a case yesterday where there is an organization, they do industrial cleaning, who are using underage children who are part of our migrant community and part of the children who are seeking things like asylums. Apparently, this organization was bringing them in during the night, so no one saw them come into the factories and into the places, and was having them clean all the machinery at industrial sites. So we even see in our modern times, there are still companies who are willing here in the United States to use children in a very abusive way. Okay. And in fact, when we compare ourselves to second world countries, that's where we start doing okay. If this was a class on, for example, criminal justice system, we would have to mention that the country that has the same proportion of adolescents and adults in the prison system, we'd have to compare ourselves to North Korea. They have about the same rate we do. And so the point of this slide is just to say, when we look at the United States, yes, we can compare ourselves to Mexico and South Africa and say that things like our foster care system is much better than when we compare ourselves to Mexico and the orphanages and systems they still use there. And so that's great. We are doing better than that, but we still have a long ways to go as far as a country as a whole. So. And this, and again, we got numbers up to 2012 on this slide. What I would say is last time I looked was 2019, and we're ticking up to about, in 2019, it was at about 4.6. These are the number of fatalities per day that can be attributed to the child maltreatments that we just mentioned to. So on average, we have between 4 to 5 children a day who are dying because of maltreatment that we're aware of. Okay. So let's talk about abuse and parent dynamics. What do we know about the family system that can create the potential for abuse to occur in the home? Okay. So the first thing, let's separate mother and father risk factors. Mother risk factors has to do with age. If they have a child while they're between the age of 18 to 23, those children are almost 10 to 15 times more likely to be abused. In fact, this is where the majority of abused children are. Some of the research of why this is not because a mother is necessarily neglectful during this period, but it is when you're 18 that mom and dad and your support systems, you had a child saying, we're not, you go deal with this. This is your problem, those kinds of things. And that can spiral very quickly for mothers who are just looking for resources and the ability for their children and them to be taken care of. Okay. In fact, we can see this in other ways. For example, a mother between 18 to 23 who is made homeless is likely to be raped and her children abused within 24 hours of becoming homeless. And those types of things. Okay. When it comes to father's risk factors, the number one that seems to create abuse in the home is the absentee of the father, and the father not being involved in the family system, including socio-emotional support, but also including physical support. Okay. And then we could look at the relationship between mother and father that contribute to all of these things. Okay. Stability of a relationship. And when we talk about a stability of a relationship, we're not only just talking if they're married or they're living together, it's whether they can co-parent together in a stable, I should say more in a consistent manner. So both parents contribute, both parents are involved, and so there's stability for the child in the relationship. We can look at toxicity of the intimate relationship itself. So when we look at specifically two individuals who are intimately involved with each other, we can look at things from one extreme of domestic violence and domestic terror on the partner's ends to toxicity on the level of verbal and psychological forms of abuse on each other. Okay. And then when we say toxicity between mother and father, I think the best way to explain this one is more of a stereotype than what we're aware of. This is when, for example, the stereotype of two parents who can't get along, and so they use the child to get back at each other and use them as quote unquote the pawn. This is what we mean about toxicity between mother and father, is that the children are used as a way of revenge or vendetta or getting back at or or trying to hurt the other partner in some way. Stability of situation is ability to stay in kind of the same home, the same place, the same community. We do know that even if you have a stable parent relationship, the more and more a child moves in early childhood, that has effects on them and can be harmful to their psychological and social well-being. Response to stress and change. We see that if, again, the parent system is positive about stress and change and changes in situation, that it can kind of, if you want to think about these two right here, it can kind of set each other off, right? So if the parent, if they have to change jobs and they have to move, if the parent is positive about it, is supportive of the child, it can, in a sense, kind of break off that negativity that occurs from constantly being moved. Okay. Education level. This is child abuse, not relationship violence. I just want to bring this up. So when we look at education level, we find that the higher the education level the parent has, the decreased chance of child abuse. I want to make this a clear point. This is correlation. So there's no cause of education on child abuse, where the relationship can be multifaceted. It can include things like higher education also brings about a higher income and a higher standard of living, all of those kinds of things. And so when we look at education level, it's not the assumptions that there's no abuse that occurs by educated people. It's probably more the situation that gets changed with the family. And I will say this too, this education level has an influence on child abuse, but when we look at things like relationship violence, so domestic violence, intimate partner violence, we see the same level of this type of violence, whether we're talking about two doctors versus two high school graduates. So while education level has an influence on child abuse rates, it has no influence on relationship violence rates, which is kind of an interesting thing. And then view of being a parent. Remember, there is always a disconnect between attitude, which is an emotion, and actual behavior. So in a lot of cases, parents will view themselves as the greatest parent in the world. Again, when I worked in the prison system and when I worked with children who were sexually abused, I heard the claim over and over and over that I'm the greatest caring parent in the world, over and over. But when you actually look at behavior of what we do with children and how we raise them, we see a much different picture. Okay. And again, there's actually some sociologists who think that this might be a cultural thing. So, you know, if you look at the United States, there is the claim, the attitude that the United States cares about children. But when you look at actual behaviors such as investment in education, investment into childcare, investment into children's growth and development, the behaviors are much more different than the attitudes. And so we think that this last one is something that is culturally handed down to us. To where we assume we care and love our children, but behaviors can be different. Okay. Any questions on any of those? You okay? This is the happy lecture. What I want to do for at least the last maybe another 10 or so minutes is start on the cognitive development section. Again, we'll come back to the child adversity studies this coming Monday, but I'd like to go ahead and just talk a little bit about cognitive development and seeing the changes from infancy going into early childhood. Okay, and just as a reminder, on the Piagetian level, this is what we're dealing with at this age, is the symbolization of our world, giving words to our world. So remember that conversation we had about language during infancy. This is when those things are really going to rapidly accelerate. And again, I know I've said this time and time again in this class. Again, by about the time we're about age 6 or 7, the average child knows around 60,000 words. So this is a very important symbolization of the world that we feel children are starting to go through. So these are some of the things that we know occur during this time period. So when we talk about symbolization, we're looking at what's called a lack of operation. What's that? Oh. So this includes one of the things that we should say is use of symbols. And we also see, and I think this is, remember when we were talking about these stages earlier, about the importance of imagination and play, okay? And we were talking about how during this age period, especially when going through role playing, that we really start to figure ourselves out, okay? Again, when we get to socio-emotional development and stuff, we'll see that our personalities are pretty well set by about the age of 5, okay? So we know that children use a lot of intuitive thinking during this period, and intuitive thinking is just coming up with solutions without any direct experience with it. So it's, whenever we have just come up with an answer, right? And sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong, but it's that intuition that starts to develop. We also see a lot of transductive reasoning during this period. So transductive reasoning is coming up with a reason why something happened. So for example, if a child wants to explain their nap time and why they shouldn't have to take a nap during a certain time, they might connect almost irrelevant events, such as maybe that's the time of the day when the dog is going outside, and so the dog being outside might not be a good time for me to sleep, kind of making those kind of awkward connections. I think that if anyone's ever watched, and if you want to see transductive thinking and reasoning in action, watch the old shows called Children or Kids Say the Darndest Things. I can't remember that it was originally done, but they did it recently, and just the reasoning they come up with. Transductive thinking is, when mom asks the little child, what is my age? And the child will either say, well, you're 10 years old or you're 100 years old. Those are all examples of transductive thinking. We've talked about this a little bit already, but we know that this stage has a lot of what we call ego centrism, so that the child kind of feels like that they're the center of the world and that the world kind of is meant to revolve around them. And again, I encouraged everybody that we're talking about egocentrism in the cognitive section, because we don't think that has anything to do with a child, okay? In fact, when we look at egocentrism, a lot of people think about, well, their spoiled child, those kinds of things. The evidence for spoiling a child is best that maybe a child can start to be spoiled at around the age of 8, 9. But there's very, very little evidence that a child can be spoiled under that age. What we do see is egocentrism, and this assumption that the world revolves around them. And again, it's in the cognitive section, long way to get to this answer. because we think that it has a lot to do with the overwhelming amount of information the child is receiving. So they need to consolidate their world in some way, okay? So we see a reduction of egocentrism when we get into middle childhood and into adolescence. But then we see the reemergence of egocentrism in later adolescence, and especially into the higher teen years when we're starting to look at, 13, 14-year-olds, okay? And again, we will introduce that in the cognitive level because we don't think it's a socio-emotional event. We think, again, when we start looking at 13, 14-year-olds, we have another kind of spurt of knowledge and growth during that period. And so the world can become a little bit overwhelming, just like in this early childhood age. Animism, okay? Animism is giving non-objects life, in a sense. I think one of the best examples, and I don't know if it's in here. I was hoping it would be. Okay, this right here. This, I think, is the best example of animism, and we can start talking a little bit about autism when we talk about this. When you ask little children what they say, and use your imagination, imagine that these, the circle, the two circles and a triangle are going in a circle, so they're animated, okay? And so one circle is behind the triangle and maybe the other one is in front of it or something like that. And when we ask children, what do you see? What's going on in this picture? Most children won't say something like, well, there's two circles and a triangle and they're going in a circle, okay? Usually what children during this age group goes is they say, well, the triangle represents Annie. And Annie is being chased by Billy, but Bob, the other circle, is trying to catch up to Billy to tell him to stop chasing Annie. So you'll hear a human drama go on instead of what you literally see, okay? Now, the population that won't do this, and this is one of the tests for autism actually, is children who are autistic. They will give the literal thing that is happening. They'll even name what type of triangle it is. So they'll literally say, well, there's a triangle and two circles, and both of them are moving in a circular motion. And they will give that very literal explanation where children who don't have autism will create some type of imaginative drama and give them animism or humanness, if you'd say. So this is probably one of the better examples of animism. And while we're here on early childhood education, we'll also go over to kind of disorders dealing with children, which is autism and ADHD. So we'll come back to this example because it shows a large difference between children who suffer from autism versus children who don't. So we'll come back to this one. And this lack of conservation, we can go to this. We've already gone over this, so I won't spend too much time on it. And in the first example we used those two beakers, remember, and then there was a different shaped beaker, okay? And you have, but in this case, you have two clay balls that are the same size. And you ask the child, are they the same or are they different? And the child will say, yeah, they're the same thing, but then you squish one of them. And you ask it, is it more or less? Are they still the same? And children under about the age of 6 will report that they changed. Either there's more with this one or there's less with this one that was changed. Okay, that's called lack of conservation or lack of understanding of mass. Okay, and remember, what this conservation task requires is a mentalization of what's going on. Okay. And this was, again, we won't go over it. This is that two mountain, or in this case, there's a teddy bear and there's a house on one side, a tree on the other. And again, remember, this is about mental rotation. If we go back to that one. Okay. I think what we'll do is we'll leave this next part, now that we kind of have an introduction to it. Let's leave this part for our next class. And we'll wrap up kind of this cognitive area. So we'll do that. And then we'll look into meaning and making. We'll talk about different kind of ideas behind child education or early childhood education. We'll talk about the importance of play, which I've been trying to emphasize. And then we're going to look at things dealing, again, going back to our language conversation with infancy, a conversation about language development and what we see with that. This, we're going to really be looking at the interaction between parent and child and what we see with that. And then we'll kind of back up. I kind of want to get into, before we get into emotional development, I kind of want to talk about the two disorders I mentioned, which is autism and ADHD, just to kind of have a glimpse at those, because it's this age group where this is diagnosed most often. But then we will get into socio-emotional development after that. Okay. All right, let me stop.